Every year, governments announce enormous victories in the war on drugs. A speedboat is intercepted in the Pacific. A hidden laboratory is destroyed in Mexico. Several tons of cocaine are discovered at a port. A cartel leader is arrested and displayed in front of television cameras. And yet, the drugs keep arriving. In fact, the United Nations estimates that global cocaine production reached a record 3,708 metric tons in 2023, around 34% more than the previous year. An estimated 25 million people used cocaine that year, while seizures also reached record levels. In other words, authorities were capturing more cocaine than ever, but traffickers were producing even more. This is the central paradox of the drug war. Law enforcement agencies can win thousands of individual battles while the overall market continues growing. To understand why, we have to follow the route stretching from the mountains of South America, through ports, jungles, and oceans, across Mexico, and finally into the world's richest consumer markets. The international cocaine trade begins primarily in 3 countries: Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. These countries contain regions where coca plants can be cultivated. Coca leaves themselves have traditional and legal uses in parts of the Andes, but criminal organizations purchase or control some of the crop and process it into cocaine. Colombia has become the largest center of cocaine production. Peru and Bolivia remain major producers, but the drugs originating there frequently move through neighboring countries before crossing an ocean. This is important because the cocaine route is not a single highway. It is a network. If authorities close one path, traffickers can shift production, use another port, employ a different criminal organization, or move through a neighboring country. Researchers often call this displacement the balloon effect. Squeeze the market in one place and it expands somewhere else. Studies of coca eradication have found that destroying additional crops can produce surprisingly small net reductions because cultivation and trafficking adapt geographically. One of the most important cocaine corridors begins on the Pacific side of South America. Cocaine produced in Colombia, or moved north from Peru, can reach the Pacific coast of Colombia or Ecuador. From there, shipments travel north through Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico. Some shipments make the journey in several stages. A load may be transferred between different groups, temporarily stored in Central America and divided into smaller quantities before continuing north. Local gangs and transportation networks may handle one section of the journey, while larger organizations coordinate financing and international distribution. The Eastern Pacific is especially difficult to control because it covers an enormous area. Traffickers use ordinary-looking fishing vessels, fast boats, and low-profile semi-submersible vessels. Some shipments are moved aboard larger commercial ships. These methods are well known to law enforcement, but knowing that a method exists is very different from locating one suspicious vessel among thousands of legitimate boats in millions of square miles of ocean. UNODC maps continue to identify major flows from the Andean countries toward North America, often through Central America and Mexico, while the Pacific remains one of the principal maritime corridors. In the fiscal year 2025, the United States Coast Guard reported seizing nearly 510,000 pounds of cocaine in the Eastern Pacific and Caribbean, the largest annual amount in its history. That represents a major operational success. But record seizures occurring alongside record production show the difference between intercepting shipments and eliminating the market that replaces them. Ecuador has become especially important. The country lies between Colombia and Peru, the world's principal cocaine-producing region, but Ecuador itself has a large legal export economy and major Pacific ports. That combination makes it an attractive transit point. Criminal organizations can move cocaine across land borders and attempt to insert it into the vast stream of legal maritime commerce. Container ships leaving South America transport bananas, seafood, coffee, and thousands of other legitimate products to North America, Europe, and Asia. Authorities cannot manually unload and search every container without bringing international trade to a halt. This creates one of the drug war's most difficult problems. Traffickers do not need to construct an entirely separate transportation system. They can exploit the infrastructure of globalization. UNODC has described Ecuador's ports as a key transit route in the international cocaine trade, particularly for shipments intended for Europe. And the organizations involved do not always control the entire port. They may instead use corruption, intimidation, or temporary cooperation with workers who have access to particular sections of the supply chain. The larger and faster global commerce becomes, the more difficult it is to inspect everything passing through it. Not all cocaine travels through the Pacific. Shipments originating in northern Colombia can move toward the Caribbean coast. Cocaine may also travel into or through Venezuela before continuing toward Caribbean islands, Central America, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, or other transfer points. The Caribbean route can involve boats, aircraft, or commercial maritime traffic. Its geography creates both opportunities and complications. The region contains thousands of islands, long coastlines, and multiple national jurisdictions. A vessel can pass near the territory of several countries during a single journey. Every border means another law enforcement agency, another legal system, and another potential delay in sharing intelligence. International cooperation has improved, and coordinated operations routinely seize drugs throughout the Caribbean. But criminal organizations only need one weak point, corrupt official, or unmonitored section of coastline to keep a route functioning. This is why traffickers frequently treat routes as temporary rather than permanent. When one island or coastal area becomes too heavily monitored, operations can move elsewhere. Farther south and east, Brazil plays a different role. Cocaine originating in Bolivia, Peru, and Colombia can move over land or by river into Brazil. Brazil has a large domestic market, but it also possesses enormous Atlantic ports with connections to Europe and Africa. From Brazilian ports, cocaine can travel directly to European destinations or pass through West Africa before continuing north. Brazil's scale makes enforcement extraordinarily difficult. The country has thousands of miles of borders, major river systems, dense forests, large cities, and some of the busiest ports in the southern hemisphere. The global cocaine market is no longer focused only on the United States. Western and Central Europe have become major destinations, and organizations from Europe increasingly work directly with suppliers and logistical networks in Colombia, Ecuador, and Brazil. This international expansion gives traffickers more options. If demand weakens or enforcement becomes stronger in one market, shipments can be redirected toward another. Mexico sits at the center of the North American drug trade for two reasons. First, it is the final major transit country for much of the South American cocaine traveling toward the United States. Shipments arriving from Central America can move through Mexico's Pacific region through interior transportation corridors or around the Gulf and Caribbean side of the country. Mexican organizations then coordinate wholesale movement toward the northern border. But Mexico is no longer simply a transit country. It is also a major production center for synthetic drugs, particularly illicit fentanyl and methamphetamine. Unlike cocaine, synthetic drugs do not require enormous coca-growing regions in the Andes. They can be produced using chemicals, equipment, and comparatively compact facilities. According to a U.S. Government Accountability Office analysis of seizures, from fiscal years 2021 through 2024, about 68% of seized fentanyl with an identified origin was reported as coming from Mexico. Most seized precursor chemicals and much of the production equipment were reported as coming from China, often through commercial shipping, air cargo, or parcel networks. The report cautions that seizure data cannot always prove exactly where a substance was manufactured, but it illustrates the international nature of the supply chain. A synthetic drug may therefore have a supply chain involving chemical manufacturers in Asia, brokers operating online, laboratories in Mexico, border transportation networks, and distributors inside the United States. Arresting one person only removes one component of that system. The public often imagines drug trafficking as people secretly crossing remote sections of the border carrying packages. That does happen, but it represents only one part of the trade. At sea, traffickers use fast boats, fishing vessels, commercial ships, and semi-submersible craft. On land, drugs travel through trucks, buses, and passenger vehicles mixed into the enormous flow of legitimate cross-border traffic. Smaller quantities can move through air travel, couriers, postal systems, and express parcel services. Cocaine is bulky enough that maritime transportation remains extremely important. Fentanyl creates a different challenge because very large numbers of doses can be transported in a much smaller physical space. GAO found that approximately 72% of fentanyl seized by Department of Homeland Security components between 2021 and 2024 had been transported in passenger vehicles. About 63% of the fentanyl was seized at official ports of entry rather than in the areas between them. Meanwhile, precursor chemicals were more commonly transported through commercial cargo systems. This does not mean every successful shipment uses the same method. It means traffickers study the legal economy and select from several transportation systems. The drug trade behaves less like one cartel-controlled pipeline and more like a global logistics industry. Governments frequently concentrate on cartel leaders. Capturing a major trafficker can disrupt communications, finances, and alliances. It may save lives and provide valuable intelligence. But it can also fragment an organization. When a leader disappears, lieutenants may fight over territory. Smaller groups may break away, form alliances with rivals, or enter other businesses such as extortion, fuel theft, kidnapping, and human smuggling. Instead of one large organization, authorities may suddenly face several smaller and less predictable ones. The product also does not disappear. As long as customers are willing to pay, another supplier has an incentive to replace the organization that was destroyed. This is one of the central economic forces behind the drug war. Prohibition raises the risks of selling drugs, but those risks also raise potential profits. A shipment can be intercepted. Several others may still reach their destination. The successful shipments cover losses, bribes, transportation, and the cost of future attempts. Enforcement changes the calculations of traffickers, but it rarely eliminates the financial incentive. Also, part of the reason why cartels are so powerful is because the politicians and the police are often members of the cartel. Some politicians are even the partners of the cartels at the highest levels, and the police often do the dirty work for them. So you can't ask the politicians or the police to combat the cartels because they are parts of them. Drug trafficking networks are adaptable because they do not depend on only one country, one cartel, or one technique. When Colombia increases eradication in one region, cultivation may move. When the Pacific is heavily patrolled, shipments may shift toward the Caribbean. When authorities strengthen inspections at one port, traffickers search for another. When cocaine becomes harder to transport, criminal groups may invest more heavily in synthetic drugs. And when one cartel loses control, another group can purchase the drugs from the same producers. The defenders face a permanent disadvantage. Governments must protect thousands of miles of coastline, hundreds of border crossings, airports, roads, ports, and shipping routes. Traffickers only need to find a few openings. Law enforcement must succeed repeatedly. A trafficking organization only needs to succeed often enough to remain profitable. But the greatest reason the drug war feels unwinnable is that it often attacks the supply without eliminating the demand. Destroying a laboratory does not cure addiction. Arresting a cartel leader does not provide treatment to someone using fentanyl. Intercepting cocaine at sea does not change the economic desperation that pushes farmers, port workers, couriers, and young recruits into the illegal economy. As long as millions of customers continue purchasing drugs, the market will attempt to supply them. And because the market is illegal, disputes cannot be settled through courts, contracts, or ordinary business regulation. They are settled through intimidation and violence. This does not mean enforcement is useless. Interdiction can prevent dangerous substances from reaching communities. Financial investigations can weaken criminal organizations. Anti-corruption efforts can protect institutions. Targeted operations can reduce violence and dismantle particularly harmful networks. But these measures are unlikely to produce a moment when governments declare that drugs have been permanently defeated. The drug war appears unwinnable because it is not really one war. It is thousands of overlapping conflicts involving poverty, addiction, corruption, international commerce, criminal finance, public health, and geography. Cocaine moves from the Andes through Ecuador, Brazil, Venezuela, Central America, the Caribbean, and Mexico. Synthetic drugs connect chemical suppliers, international cargo systems, Mexican laboratories, and North American distribution networks. The methods constantly change: boats, commercial containers, vehicles, aircraft, and parcels. Every time authorities block one route, the market searches for another. Perhaps the mistake is believing victory means creating a world in which no illegal drugs exist. A more realistic definition would be reducing overdose deaths, treating addiction, protecting institutions, lowering cartel violence, and making the illegal market less profitable. Because after decades of eradication campaigns, military deployments, border operations, and record-breaking seizures, one fact remains unchanged. As long as demand survives, someone will attempt to supply it. And that is why the war on drugs can win battle after battle, while the war itself seems to have no end.